Hi, good afternoon. So welcome to the final breakout session for this year's conference. Obviously, with travel schedules, a lot of people are headed to the airport already, but I just wanted to introduce myself. Adam Smith is with me with the Institute for Community Alliances. I've asked a handful of other coalition directors to join us. They may or may not join us, but if not, we'll go through some of the information for this session. And so, again, my name is Scott Chambor. I'm the Chief Housing Officer of the City Borough of Juneau. I've been working in the homelessness field for about 10 years now. First getting started on the local level in Juneau, being staff and chair of the Juneau Homeless Coalition for a number of years. At about the time when we recognized that we needed to do a better job figuring out who was homeless in our community, and started things like doing our annual count routinely. We put together Project Homeless Connect, recognized we weren't engaging with the most vulnerable, so doing vulnerability index street outreach surveys, and then ultimately creating programs based on that information, medical respite program, a Juneau Affordable Housing Fund at the city, as well as the recently opened Juneau Housing First Collaborative Supportive Housing Project. After working on the local level coalition for a while, I moved to the state and been heavily involved in the Alaska Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, really trying to get the statewide advocacy board or body up and running and as vibrant as it is today. And so from a lot of those lessons, I utilized a lot of resources and effective coalition building. And one of the things we want to make sure that we get out to communities is some of these common resources so that, one, you know that they're available, and two, they can help you create support for the work you're doing in our community. And so on this first slide, this is not anything groundbreaking that I've created myself. I'm a big fan of not recreating the wheel, but really utilizing key solid resources that are out there and available for people who want to address homelessness in their community. And so I start off this conversation with 3 resources for you to take a look at. The first is the U.S. Interagency Council on the Homeless. Their whole mission is collaboration and coalition building. Their mission is to coordinate amongst the 19 federal agencies that have some sort of interest in funding or providing resources for entities that work on housing and homeless issues. And so they're really good at what they do, and over the years have developed a lot of great best practices. So please go to their website and refer to that materials that they have there very often. The second resource, and again, Adam and I just had a conversation about this. There's a lot of lingo, there's a lot of programs, there's a lot of agencies, federal and state, which you could potentially tap into for resources. There's not necessarily a clearinghouse for this information in your community, but there is on the federal level. Diane Yentel's group, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, puts together an advocacy guide every year. And for the first number of years working on this issue, hard copy was on my desk and I referred to it routinely. And so I'd go and meet with a service provider and they'd mention a program and I didn't want to ask them directly what that was, so I'd go back to my office and then look it up. So it's a great resource. It usually has a kind of one-page summary, 1 or 2-page summary about the details of the program, and then you can kind of figure out how that funding gets to your state and potentially to your community. The other piece, specifically for coalitions, and I have hard copies of this here today for those who are interested, but there's also links online, is HUD in 2009 recognized that they were starting to require through their funding streams that communities collaborate and combine efforts to end homelessness. And so they put together this manual called Building Effective Coalitions. And so this is here, it's about 60 pages, and it's really geared not to just in general, it's really geared to how to build effective coalitions around homeless assistance programs. So this is kind of a manual for you and your local community to do the work that you're trying to do with as many community partners as possible. And so I took a couple of the slides from this, and we'll cover it. And then we have some prompting questions at the end that we can talk about, and then we could just have a conversation about some of the barriers or some of the unique efforts that you're seeing as effective as you build coalitions in your community. So the first thing to go over is the very basics. What is a coalition? Obviously, you need to come together to solve a problem, reach common goals, and focus on that collaboration. This day and age, it's an absolute necessity to collaborate. A long time ago, you hear stories of housing projects, low-income housing projects or homeless projects being solely funded by HUD, and you didn't have to collaborate. Now, there's been recent studies that it's at least 8 funding sources on average in order to get a supported housing project done. And so obviously that's a lot of communication that needs to go in place just to get a single project done. As you know, what are the benefits of a coalition? More efficient delivery system, improved communication, enhanced understanding of homeless community needs. I think in our last section we talked about there's a different approach towards homelessness depending on the sector that you may work in. If you're from the healthcare industry, you're kind of grown up with the concept that if there's somebody presenting with a service or a healthcare need, that you're going to do whatever it takes to provide that service, kind of whatever the costs. However, when that healthcare world tries to mesh with the housing world, as we've learned all week, there's a scarcity of housing resources. Across the country, 1 in 4 people who need housing assistance receive it. And so realistically, all housing providers are working on a prioritization model. How can we prioritize who needs this scarce resource quickly? One of the stories that I've encountered frequently in Juneau when trying to put together various projects and programs has been frustrated police officers or case managers at hospitals who are frustrated with the housing system in our community and like, why can't we get this person housed? And so they want to take charge and they're like, well, I'm going to go find this, I'm going to house this person. And then they try for about a week and they're like, oh my God, you guys are right. It's very complicated to find housing for this person who visits our hospital all the time. So it's really making sure there's communication amongst entities that are really kind of working to try and solve the same problem. What makes a coalition successful? These are some key concepts it covers more in depth in the program. Some of these you may have heard from some leadership type programs. Clear expectations, strong leadership, adequate staffing, and in our case I put on there HMIS and coordinated entry participation as we look forward to the new world we are in this sector. One of the observations in working with a lot of the local coalitions around the state is that staffing for this coalition piece is often very much difficult to A, come by, and B, can lead to the successes of a community or not. And so over the years, you could have seen a lot of coalitions have had times where they've found funding to have permanent staff, which really coordinates well and moves things forward in your community. Other times you've hired paid staff and the staff didn't really work out so well, so you kind of did the same as you were without the staff. Or other times, there's just dynamic leadership amongst your coalition that it actually works a little bit better without having a paid position for your local coalition. So there's various different ways, but I think the key piece is the clear expectations and the leadership amongst the makeup. Barriers, obviously. Again, lots of barriers can derail the common momentum and the common goals, especially if you don't have those goals. One of the observations in working with a lot of the local coalitions around the state is that staffing for this coalition piece is often very much difficult to A, come by, and B, can lead to the successes of a community or not. And so over the years, you could have seen a lot of coalitions have had times where they've found funding to have permanent staff, which really coordinates well and moves things forward in your community. Other times you've hired paid staff and the staff didn't really work out so well, so you kind of did the same as you were without the staff. Or other times, there's just dynamic leadership amongst your coalition that it actually works a little bit better without having a paid position for your local coalition. So there's various different ways, but I think the key piece is the clear expectations and the leadership amongst the makeup. In terms of the local homeless coalitions, I know also in Juneau that where that person was housed greatly impacted how effective the local coalition was. And so there's lots of stories about going from a United Way to the city or back again. And so it's a constant dialogue as to, what is the right organization, and does that organization's core mission fit well with ending homelessness, as most of the advocates who want to be a part of this process really are. Another barrier that we have seen, and you may have some examples in your local community, is the funding piece. You may be interested in collaborating until a grant comes out, and you want it more so than the other entity in your collaborative group. And so those are some real and difficult conversations that can again drive coalitions away from the core mission of ending homelessness. There have been instances of coalitions that I've been a part of that all of a sudden one agency or another just kind of disappears and doesn't start attending meetings or providing input. Something's going on, and all of a sudden they're going in a completely different direction. And at that point, hopefully you have strong enough leadership that can kind of bring the conversation back to say, hey, are we still on our common mission of ending homelessness, or what's going on now with your organization? That is a constant conversation piece, and I think, again, it goes back to the strong leadership piece in your community. Do you have somebody who's willing to have those difficult conversations, those interagency conversations? Poor organizational capacity, we talked about that in the last slide. And again, making your coalition meetings interesting and engaging. Again, it goes back to the leadership and common goals. A lot of times, it's realized that this stuff is really hard. This is really hard work, and there are lulls into how effective your coalition is. And so, making sure that your meeting setup and arrangement is interesting and important for the agencies that are participating. The last piece on the barriers is municipal leaders and legislators are currently not involved. So reaching out to them and making sure that they have a spot at the table as you try to end homelessness. Okay, so another section in the HUD guidance is all around building community-wide coalitions. I often get asked the question, well, what if I'm the only agency in town, I'm a small community, and I am the coalition? And I think the answer to that question and kind of the real life example is kind of the push that Sue Steinecker has done up in Nome. It started out as she was an individual who was just interested in this topic on her own, but slowly kind of expanded her network to the point where she recognized recently that it's not just her community dialogue, she needs to get partners in a region. And so for Nome and that area, it's really a regional conversation, and they're finding a way to make that happen in that part of Alaska. Again, like I mentioned earlier, there's multiple ways to form a coalition that can be effective. Some have paid staff, some don't. Some meet routinely and have report outs, and that works just fine. But others want to be more engaged and have started to put together plans and are working towards system performance measures and really using data to gauge where they go forward. Another piece of building a community-wide coalition is, again, understanding what each agency wants from the coalition. Obviously, in Juneau, we have a core agencies who make up the housing provision that provide emergency shelter, transitional housing, and supportive housing. But we have a lot of folks who are just interested in general, how can they help? Or their agency might provide a service. So recognizing as you meet and you engage in these dialogues to how to keep the mainstream agencies engaged and involved in a dialogue that can often just get very siloed into COC and HMIS and all kinds of alphabet soup talk. And then the final thing about the community-wide coalition, it's a nebulous thing. It's going to change over time, and so you're going to have to, periodically take a break and a small hiatus and say, hey, where are we now? What defines us as a coalition? What has changed? Are we having an impact on our local homeless population? Where we stand. So being sure that somebody can stop and have that conversation. Mainstream agencies. We talk a lot about COC, knowing who's the shelter providers, transitional housing, supportive housing, but we also know that in order for people to no longer be homeless, for people to be successful, they need employment, they need access to health care. And so again, as your coalition meets to tackle maybe a core issue, maybe you need a shelter, and that's the impetus for forming a coalition, but recognizing that's not going to be the end of the conversation. And so making sure that mainstream agencies know where your priorities are now and where they need to go in the future. One of the conversations that we talked about in Juneau for the last 4 years is the Homeless Coalition had basically set a goal 4 years ago that they were all in on filling a gap in the system. The coalition had stated numerous times that we support creating supported housing with the healthcare clinic, and that we're going to put all of our effort and resources amongst the collaborative agencies into that effort. However, we were able to tell other partners that, I heard about opioid interventions. What about, prison reentry? What about these new things that we can potentially talk about or gain momentum for in our community? And the coalition had basically, no, we're pursuing this permanent supportive housing because we think it's the key piece right now. But once it's established, we'll be ready to look at the next step. And so, and luckily in Juneau, in our community now, that conversation has begun anew at the coalition and started to look at the next steps, which are scattered site permanent supportive housing and more solicitation of services like the assertive community treatment team to fill in newer identified gaps. Again, it comes down to capacity and collaboration for collaborating with mainstream agencies. Being as clear as you can be amongst your local coalition to engage with the education piece, talking with your school district, talking with your Department of Corrections locally, just constantly providing information to anybody who will listen, really, as to where your coalition, what your focus is. It's very difficult to do, especially when you're trying to serve people and have a family life and have some sort of balance, but it's something that constantly needs to be on your radar. Other things for collaborating with mainstream agencies, setting up contracts for certain services, co-locations with entities that are providing a similar service or you could partner with, again, in the magic words of coordination and collaboration. Building a coalition's membership, again, these things are fluid, as you know. People are engaged for a bit because they like a certain aspect of what you're focusing on at the local level, and then they'll disappear for a while, but they'll come back. Having a clear organization structure going forward is important. On the state coalition level, we've really been trying to reach out for years to expand participation, and I'm really excited about the inclusion of more smaller rural representation on our board, because that's been a huge piece. But you can also organize that through the structure of your bylaws for your local coalitions. You know, mandating that a certain entity or a certain sort of representation is involved in your conversations. And again, it's that outreach and recruitment piece. And so that is the basics of what information is entitled here in the HUD reference package. Again, the resources that listed at the front I've utilized routinely, and I think when you look at remaking your coalition from year to year, I would always revisit that manual, because it really emphasizes the things that you should be working at. And now we'll go back to questions. So originally, I had a couple of panelists to join us from local coalitions, but they actually departed for the airport. So I'm just going to put these prompting questions out to the group, and we'll talk about some of the positive things and potentially some of the difficult things that you're finding. So the first question is, what is a local example of effective coalition building that you've had recently? Yeah, we're going to need the mic.
Yeah, here in Fairbanks, we're not quite as far along as some of the other coalitions. So we're not to the point where we're doing a lot of collaborative projects yet. But we're getting together on problems that we're seeing. You know, we did a SWOT analysis, we did a strategic plan, we've identified community gaps, and we're starting to go forward on those. So I think that's kind of an example of an effective use of a coalition is to do a real community SWOT analysis and figure out where your weaknesses are and fill those gaps.
Yeah. And Sue, I just used you as a case study, and so I mentioned that when I first started, talking with you years ago, that you're like, I'm a one-person show. I don't have a coalition. I can't start a coalition. But as evidenced by our plenary session today, that you basically figured out who your coalition is, and it's actually a regional coalition more so than it was just who you thought the natural players were.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with, exactly what this is and how to do it. But I guess maybe without realizing we've been building a coalition without calling it that. But I think this conference has we had more people together that we needed from Nome at the table here than we've been able to have in Nome. And I think I go home feeling like, okay, I think I know how to move forward now. So we're getting there.
Great. Any other local examples of how things are coming together in your community? Terry?
Do you want to hear it?
Sure.
So I'm part of the Juneau Reentry Coalition, and that is a coalition of people that are individuals, and organizations who are interested in bringing together, interested in serving people who are reentering the community after incarceration. And we have a chairperson who is a person with lived experience of incarceration, and then the other chairperson is a probation officer or the security officer probation inside the prison in Juneau. And having those two side by side, two former adversaries, if you will, that come together, she's able to offer him her challenges that she observed being an incarcerated person, and he offers his challenges as being the authority figure, I guess. And so the two of them are very good for bringing information and a perspective that we don't often think of when we work in the provider arena. But one of the things that we've done to bring people together is we've put together this questionnaire that asks local organizations what kinds of services they provide for people who are reentering the community after incarceration. And so we've put together a resource list, but through that question and answering exercise, we've been able to identify more agencies that provide some kind of reentry service that we didn't know about in the first place. So we're in the process of doing that kind of reaching out and finding out who in the community actually provides the services that we're looking for, and then recruiting them to come to the coalition meetings. And we're a very active coalition, and we're doing a lot of stuff. And but I think having active people was the key for us. Going to the people that we knew were active, you know, like spotting someone at a meeting who was raising their hand and speaking a lot and had a passion, that we'd go kind of toddle up to them after the meeting and say, hey, I want to recruit you, you know, and bring them in. So that was, I think getting active people or action-oriented people was the key for us, because we have an active coalition.
Yeah. So you were demonstrating strong leadership by going actively recruiting.
We were. You could say that. And we have a team of active leaders. Our group is not lacking in leadership. We have to fight each other for the leadership. I mean that in a friendly way.
Yeah, no, that's a good problem to have, really.
I think part of this is the terminology. My agency just celebrated 30 years last Friday. And what I've learned from being there since 1990 is that I learned quickly nobody has enough money. Nobody does all the services, and mine does most of the services, most of the housing. But we just don't call it coalition, so I had to adjust how I framed it, because you can bet, and they call me. And so we are working together, we just aren't an organized body.
Right.
And we do have a continuum of care, and it is oftentimes getting them there that's a problem. We have 3 tribes in our area, for instance, and we've tried to pursue them, but I intend to go home again and say, you need to be here.
Right.
And so I think that sometimes it seems overwhelming, because you think, well, we aren't going to have a coalition, but you may already have a loose coalition that you've used for 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, and I think, you know, in a lot of instances you see, you know, agencies or potential leaders are basically just adverse to meetings. But if you give them the proper information afterwards, they're participants in that way. So you see that kind of informal kind of coalition in a lot of places too that can work. So the next question is data related, and a quick story here. You know, one of the things that we had recognized in Juneau for a long time is that we had a core chronic homeless population, very significant, had been on the street for an average of 10 years or more. However, we couldn't concretely explain that situation. We could tell the narrative. We had the people story. We had the visual story of folks knowing who these persons experiencing homelessness were on our streets, but we didn't have the data. And so the key component of getting our permanent supportive housing project was when we did a vulnerability street outreach index in 2012. We got 40 volunteers from the community to go out in the morning, 3 mornings in a row, and do the vulnerability index survey, which gathered a lot of data, which we could then go, hey, we have a narrative, and we also have this information. We should solve this problem. And so the next question is really leading for you guys to understand what is the role that data plays in your coalition and your meetings, if you do have meetings, because it's increasingly important to our statewide system. So who wants to take a crack at that? And if not, I have Adam here with suggestions on how other communities are doing it this way. So Catherine.
We use HMIS. It's been a godsend for me, because I also write the grants. Mm-hmm. And I need numbers to convey the need. I also need them for I will not give up on my second-class borough. I lobby nonstop with my assembly members and my mayors. And when I have hard numbers, which HMIS provides, pretty much any way I want, that's wonderful. Because then it's not just, oh, here comes Catherine again. It's like, no, here, look at these numbers. And it's been a real boon to us.
I can give an example from outside of Alaska. I spent a lot of time working in the Wisconsin balance of state, which is the 7th or 8th largest balance of state region in the country. Yes, Alaska's number 1. I mean, you guys get that title in terms of square miles. You guys have more square miles than anybody. But even a smaller balance of state area has logistical issues and has different communities. As an example, in Wisconsin, the southeastern part of the state is Kenosha, which is a few miles outside of Chicago, and it's part of the Chicago metropolitan statistical area. And then in the far northwestern part of the state is a town called Superior, which is near Duluth, Minnesota. And by car, those are 7.5 hours between them. And the people who live in Duluth have nothing in common with the people in Superior. So, but they're part of the same continuum of care, and so they have the same goals that they have to do, overarching goals. But the local coalitions are very different. The things that they focus on are different. Their priorities are different. And one of the things we set out to do about 8 or 9 years ago was to come up with some commonalities for them to focus on when it came to homelessness and housing. And we decided to take the HMIS data that we had, and each community was collecting this data, and we decided to present it back to them with some salient data points and make them as universal as possible across the communities, but they were data points specific to the community. So when we went to Kenosha, we were talking about Kenosha data. When we went to Green Bay, we were talking about Green Bay data. And when I had my data analyst folks put this data together, I said, we're going to tour the state, kind of like a rock band at a summer festival, like a Lollapalooza. And the person that I said this to said, oh, you mean it's going to be a data palooza? And we actually called them data paloozas. And so we did these data paloozas around the state. And what happened is, this is, in many cases, is the first time they ever saw their local data represented and presented to them. Ever. And they've been collecting it for years and years. And the hope was that using that data to identify what they've done or where their needs are would get them talking about data as part of the regular conversation. And in some of the communities, it's worked really well to the point that every single year, for example, Green Bay, Wisconsin, they ask us for a data palooza year after year. They want us to come back and tell us how they're doing. And we do it not just because we want them to use their data, although they haven't been using it as much as we want them to. What happens is during those local coalition meetings, they bring in stakeholders that they otherwise wouldn't have at the table on any other given week of the month or any time of the year. So local community foundations that fund some of their programs, United Way staff. They invite city council members. They invite county board supervisors to come to these events. They actually bring people to the table that otherwise aren't there, and it's because they're talking about data at a local level. And so data can be used kind of like a magnet to attract people to events that otherwise wouldn't be there, but you want them to be there. And so think about it from that standpoint, that you're not just talking to the people in the room. You may be using this data to talk to people that should be in the room.
Great. Any questions for Adam? Okay, so the next question is, what are the main barriers for your local coalition? It's the end of the day. I understand. Just keep it involved.
Well, like I said, we're pretty new. I think we kind of just maybe became a coalition at this conference. But we did. They were calling me a coalition of the Nome Coalition of One, but now we're the Seward Peninsula Housing Coalition. But I think that I think that a lot of us lack much knowledge or information about how to even begin to address housing problems. It's almost as if we needed somebody that can help us be aware of options and how to connect those dots, and to potentially solve some of our problems and show us how as a coalition we can do that. But I think we're still lacking knowledge of those, how to solve our problems. We know we have them.
And that kind of segues into the last question, which was, I think, answered a little bit there. How can the Alaska Coalition on Housing and Homelessness, help your efforts in the community?
An idea that's come up a couple of times, not just by myself, but Catherine as well, and others at our last roundtable, the need for mentorship.
Right.
That if a new council could bring someone much more experienced at this and experienced at the housing world to come and, mentor us through a particular project, or again, how to create, how to, all this blending of funding streams and what they are, I think that would go a long way. It's that, and the coalition is, we're going to put up a small communities page on the coalition website where we can start listing granting opportunities, but there comes a point where still when you're new, you need mentorship. So
Right.
I think that would help tremendously.
Yep. Anybody else?
So there seems to be a consensus around the need for really some formalized technical assistance as part of the structure that comes from the coalition. It seems like that would be beneficial for folks.
Yep. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay. Well, good luck. And again, I think, one of the main goals of the state coalition is to broaden its breadth there, and be as assistive to communities as possible. One of the big, and this is some background information, one of the big impetuses of changing our HMIS administrator was the fact that we did not have data for balanced estate communities as of 2 years ago. And so already we can see how that is playing a huge impact. Brian's got a big push to get even more communities to participate in the point-in-time count in the future. And then obviously, his technical assistance has been really, when invited or as necessary, to get out and speak to your communities, even to have those difficult discussions with city councils, and to come in with a kind of a neutral voice in your community. So I'll just wrap it up from here and just say, again, from the coalition board, thank you for attending the conference. And if you have questions on any of this material or need assistance, you can contact Brian or myself, and we'll help where we can. So thank you.
And if you want one of these guides, come on up and grab one.